I'm going to stray away from this presentation a bit. It struck me as Brock was talking. He gave a lot of good background on how things are shaping externally and globally, and then what does that mean for the country. But then I want to bring it into our area in terms of like, how do you actually do economic development? And I'll take you back to 2016 when we started. And I'll say economic development at a scale that's recognizable across the region. So in my background, I've had a couple of experiences with this. And one was in the formation of an energy cluster. And the energy cluster by itself means you have a number of like-minded companies that you can grab the synergies from to be able to advance and expand upon. And sometimes that can be centered around manufacturing. Sometimes that can be centered around operations or other things. And it worked really well in North Carolina. It really expanded that region from an energy potential. But it was already urban-based, and it was really easy to take off and go. But that cluster, that formation cluster, really is part of a platform. And then I had some other experience in looking and working with a rural state in terms of how do you generate economic development through the use of a platform. Now, there's a few things that you need to do that. At that time, we were marketing. If you developed a nuclear plant or nuclear plants, because of the scale of those plants, you could create a cluster. You could you weren't talking about a clean energy center. You were talking really about jobs, taxes, and education. It had nothing to do with nuclear, right? So, but how do you create those things? Well, nuclear energy happens to bring that level of scale. When you build a facility, you can drive the scale to create the parameters. Well, in that case, you need three things really to get that up off the ground and functioning. You need stable policy. Thank you, Bill Walker, for that. All right, and thank you, Lisa Thompson, and thank you, Doug Ford. Provincial policy around energy has to be stable because it's long duration. And then you need to take the steps to have the cluster to pull in the companies, but you need the communities that want it and want to support it. And then you have to have a company that's a willing host. Well, that last time the local utility wasn't from that area, many just simply didn't want to do it. They wanted to keep running there and bringing all their other stuff back to their home office that was somewhere else. So that was an education. And then you need kind of an institute that helps to shape all those things. So in 2016, when I started thinking about what we were doing here at Bruce Power and what Bruce, Huron, and Grey counties and the Saugeen Ojibwa Nation and other partners had here, we had that formation. Well, Bruce Power, I could easily be the willing host because it was our headquarters. We had stable provincial policy. We had supportive communities. We just needed to pull some of the pieces together around the energy cluster, the like-minded companies, start the institute to start to push things forward, and then we could create an environment that really could go in any direction that the local municipalities and authorities wanted it to go. So we set out on a stage then to start talking about economic development in a very large way, but in regard to these models. So it's the how-to, right? How do you capitalize on everything that Brock talked about? It's by doing these things. And we put in a foundation that once this gets started, it starts to spin off other connections to other industries like agriculture, like software, like manufacturing, and on and on and on. Why? Because you start to bring the necessary components into the area. You know, if I remember back to 2016, one of the biggest issues were all the young people were leaving. Like, and they were leaving for an education and then not coming back home. You know, when I look now, we've had 31,000 job applicants for about 1,000 jobs over the last 2 or 3 years for Bruce Power. So it means people are wanting to come back to the area again, right? And I'm sure our partner companies here are also doing that. So when you look at what we have as a willing host, so Bruce Power is the supplier of 30% of the electricity for Ontario at 30% less than the average cost. So think about that. That puts us in a really good space from a policy perspective to keep the policy stable with the help of folks like Bill Walker, Lisa Thompson, Doug Ford, Todd Smith. When that is stable, then it enables the investment into Bruce Power's assets, which is the second big thing that we're doing here. We're investing $13 billion from 2016 through 2033. So it gives the infusion and the catalyst for economic development and growth. And then we've also started now to create another platform with our partners in the Saugeen Ojibwa Nation, a company called Gamzukum and Akazawin that focuses on isotopes and isotope production. And that now starts to layer a different technology set in. But as you heard Brock taught, and the creation of the Institute over time is the Nuclear Innovation Institute is its name, but it was really set up to do a number of things, like to keep things like the economic development platform and the collaboration of all the local communities functioning and keeping those meetings happening and working with municipal governments to understand what was needed or not needed or wanted or not wanted to make sure that those venues stayed open. And then also to introduce an infusion in the area of science, technology, engineering, and math. You may or may not be aware, but one of the biggest things that the Nuclear Innovation Institute is doing, it's bringing computer programming in terms of both artificial intelligence language and coding into the classrooms. I think the last count I got from Bruce Wallace, something like 10,000 kids, 95 classrooms, and 284 teachers now have been trained on how to teach computer programming, how to do computer programming, and not only that, but artificial intelligence language programming. AI programming is equal to automation, right? And in the region, if we're going to capitalize on the things that Brock just said, understanding automation is going to be part and parcel to any developing economy going forward, simply because of the population issues. So children in this area will now have a step up or a leg up in this venue because they're learning these things at the elementary school level and at the high school level. And that will prepare them for the jobs of the future. But that's also balanced with a strong science curriculum that NII teaches that will put that information or that knowledge to work in practical projects, practical summer camps, and also there's an accredited class that they started teaching around basic sciences, not taking the place of education, but helping to be a tool for local educators so that we can get really outside the classroom in terms of a dimension that isn't otherwise available. And then the other side of the Innovation Institute is taking that technology in what I'll say that energy cluster, we call it now the clean energy frontier, and start to evolve that into projects. And projects and policy support. Like you'll start to hear us talking about hydrogen in a big way, and that's tied to agriculture and carbon offsets and carbon credits, and the ability then to look at clean energy sources like pumped hydro in the area. See, that's really what is under construction here. It's really a clean energy center. And that clean energy center brings jobs, taxes, and education to the area. And those three things build long-term well-being for the communities. One of the things we're still, thanks to Georgian College, we do have some secondary education available, but we do need a university in the area. Like, that's the next piece of this puzzle. And then, so as you think about this is the how to go about doing. And the glue that holds it all together is the cooperation of the different parties. Like, any one group can cause it to fail, quite frankly. Any one group, or especially if a group is against something stringently, they can probably cause it to derail and stall. Because these things have to happen together in unison and in a format that really continues to advance. Again, as far as the communities want it to go. But I will say that stimulus, or that catalyst that comes from Bruce Power's Life Extension Program, has a duration. And that, like I said, that duration started in 2016 and will continue through 2033 when the last of our units are refurbished. So that initial push, that initial seeding will stall. So what's next, right? What's next for the energy frontier? Well, it's pumped hydro. Well, it's hydrogen. Well, it's maybe wind, solar, other energy forms. Well, it could be a number of things that generate that, but then there's, again, the ancillary businesses that come from that, the technology pieces, the movement into manufacturing, the movement into software support, manufacturing the area because we have energy, right? A lot of places will be short energy. Well, we're not short energy. We've got lots of it in this area, right? So it's this thinking and this planning that when you look at it from an economic development perspective, when I listen to Brock talk, it's a good news story for us because we've got the foundational components in place. We've got a running start at this to leverage all the difficulties and issues that you hear him talk about coming. We can leverage past that because we have put some of the foundational pieces in place over the last years. And that's what now with that background, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what is it that we can do with this foundation and where can we take it. You see, our life extension program at Bruce Power is generating about $4 billion of economic activity in Ontario. And why is that? Well, unlike many supply chains, our supply chain is right here in Ontario. 90% of every dollar that we spend stays in Ontario. And 95 to 98% of all the money we spend stays in Canada. We don't have those supply chain issues that Brock talked about. So not only can we look to our area to grow, you can see our influence and our fingerprints all throughout Ontario and all throughout Canada. Now, leveraging that up, and Jessica has done some economic studies here locally. I'll throw some of those numbers out. It starts to create that impetus, right? That jobs, that tax base, influence into the area. Our spinoff of nuclear, we started to look at how do we grow and how do we diversify. We've always made cobalt-60, but we're now doing it at a scale where we're sterilizing 40% of the once-used medical devices around the world. So out of our poor little community in Tiverton, where the plants are, we have a global reach for cobalt-60. We're also using cobalt-60 for cancer treatments in terms of brain tumors, breast cancer treatments. This past year, we finally got implemented an idea that we came up with in 2010, 2011 in Framatome. And it was a new way of producing isotopes inside a reactor. And that partnership formed with Framatome and Kinetrix, and then again, another willing host. Why wasn't it done sooner? We didn't have a willing host, right? So we got a willing host. Now we have a brand new isotope production system in play and a partnership with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation now to manufacture isotopes in Bruce County in the Saugeen Territory. The production system, it means that we're able to make isotopes online all the time. Historically, isotopes have been made in very small microreactors or cyclotrons or research reactors, I should say, not microreactors, but research reactors. So you get a very small amount. It's like probably a bucket of water compared to Lake Huron. And our first isotope that we are making now is lutetium-177, which is a prostate cancer treatment. And it's also being used for other forms of cancer research like theranostics, where it does a whole body diagnosis and treatment at the same time. And that's being done now by Rebecca Wong out of the University Health Network in Toronto. So what do you see there, right? You see the expansion of the capability to advance science and medicine here in Ontario. Why? Because we can make the isotopes at scale. So the next step now is the scale up. So with our partners, we're looking at Urbidium-90, which is a liver cancer treatment. Right now, that treatment is scattered across the world and they hardly get any sample. We project in our first test run we'll make more Urbidium-90, Y90 than what's made everywhere else in the world when that happens, and we're in the process of doing that. The next step then is what's the next 6 isotopes? So the team is working on now a production envelope that would scale to advance 6 isotopes forward. Now, why is that important? It's important because Ontario, through stable policy, again, thanks to Bill Walker, got bipartisan support to create a center of excellence in Ontario for isotope production and cancer treatment with isotopes. When we can get to that level of scale, now suddenly that opens us up to advancing to manufacturing. Right now, for lutetium-177, we have to send that isotope to Germany to be processed. Well, if we have that kind of scale, why wouldn't we do that here in our area, right? So it's a building block component, these scales. So the companies need to look into the future. And I know I see David Harris back there. I know he's been actively thinking about this for a while. But we also have then local airports that we can fly isotopes to and from. And then what stops us from having a center for research for cancer at Owen Sound? What stops the hospital system from being able to take those next steps if we can get to that scale with that level of industrial support and attracting that level of collaboration amongst the industries and the medical community? See, that's how you do economic development for the long term from the industrial side. We're building another cluster. We have an energy cluster. We need the pumped hydro, right, to come next. We need the hydrogen piece to come next, right? We've got wind, solar, nuclear, and you start to spiral it. That's the discussion around safe, reliable electricity. And when you have that as a base, it then starts to spawn off those manufacturing opportunities, those education opportunities as people come. Those advanced educational opportunities are going to be needed. we're going to need to train those technicians and those engineers here in our communities. Right now, the nearest engineering school is about a 2.5 hour drive. That's simply too far, right? So I think the first step NII is looking at is distance learning, but at some point, we'll want to seek advancement into that space. The job creation and economic growth, I think Jessica had a report out, and I think she'll talk some about that this afternoon. But that, again, that has benefits, but that also has some needs. And this is where the municipalities really have to make decisions on those needs, like housing, like other infrastructure, recreation facilities, medical facilities, and the like. You see, the ISO just put out a Pathways to Decarbonization report in the last month. And what it starts to look at is what does it take for the clean energy transition to move to 2050 to be net zero. And it starts to look at the addition of 88,000 megawatts here in Ontario. Think about that. At Bruce Power, we're 8,000 megawatts. That's 10 companies like ours that will need to be added into the Ontario electric grid. That creates opportunities for our clean energy center, right? Think about that. It could mean more nuclear. It could mean more renewables. It could mean pumped hydro. It could mean hydrogen production. And why? Because we've got now the cluster of companies in the area that will be capable of building those types of things, and the manufacturing based in Ontario to be able to do it so that we don't have supply chain disruptions. I knock on wood all the time, but throughout the pandemic, we had no supply chain disruptions at Bruce Power. That's why we're able to be 7 years into our life extension program and continuing to tick along. All that was made right here in Ontario. And we helped our partner companies, because we have a cluster, to keep functioning throughout the pandemic. And then they also helped our communities to keep functioning with their support. This really presents the opportunity now for continued growth in the area. And you have the model in place, right? We talked about that with the Clean Energy Center. We call it the Clean Energy Frontier. It's set up and functioning. All told, it's bringing hundreds of millions of dollars of tax revenue into the area, thousands of jobs, and housing development, and abandoned and boarded up storefronts. Hundreds of thousands of square feet of office and manufacturing space are now back into production in the area. So these opportunities that you see now coming from the Clean Energy Center are here. And I said the stimulus will drive it from Bruce Power's life extension for another 10 years. The items we want to talk through today, I think, as a group, is we should not be wasting that time. Like, we need to make some decisions around things and really actively work together to move things forward within our area that you all want, right? And that means everybody. Like, what do we need in the area? And we should be actively looking for those things. I think when you talk about the growth, I think this is a pretty good slide, and I stole it from Jessica's report to a degree, because I think it really does put the framework around the items we're talking about. You know, in our area, provincially, we're contributing about $473 million in tax base, but locally it's $233 million. That's a sizable amount of money that's being put out. And when you look at the growth in census, you're seeing about 7% growth in Bruce County, and that again then spreads throughout the other counties. At the bottom, when you look at the Ontario Ministry of Finance projections, we're expecting a 25 to 40% growth in Grey Bruce and Huron counties by 2046. That's the opportunity, right? That's a projection. What's wrong with models? They're always wrong, right? Models are always wrong. It's people that make the difference in the model and what we choose to do or not do, and how we choose to either work together or not work together in terms of creating those outcomes. The challenges that are in front of us: housing, right? Affordable housing in the communities that can sustain these solutions and sustain growth. Healthcare, making sure that we can recruit physicians and nurses into the area and have a growing healthcare system. Labor, there are labor shortages. We're going to be automating, right? We're going to need to bring technology into our communities and into our businesses. You know, the agricultural communities are going to automate. Some of the manufacturing's got to automate. But that requires a level of knowledge to be able to do that I would argue now that our kids in our schools are starting to learn how to do this level of programming and understand this technology, right? They'll be the ones taking us through these next steps. That ties us into the educational pieces, to be able to continue and advance that education here locally. And then there's other issues in the area like infrastructure, like childcare, like transportation, like quality of life, healthy quality of life, which is pretty good here. You know, we have all these foundations that enable economic development to be possible. And all that ominous information that Brock put out, we are positioned to take advantage of that. And it's now the how-tos and what do we need to do as a group of people focused on economic development, community well-being. You know, what spaces do we want to advance in? We have some opportunities in agriculture. Why? The clean energy transition is going to look for carbon offsets. We can expand our agriculture through carbon offsets, as well as food production. We have the opportunity through clean energy. Well, why? We're anchored by the largest nuclear operating facility in the world. And we have the opportunities to build pumped hydro, to build batteries, to move into hydrogen that can also partner with agriculture on hydrogen. We have now medical isotopes that are starting to scale. We have the ability to move into the medical field and grow that. That's how you attract physicians and nurses with exciting technologies, exciting things, and state-of-the-art equipment. We can scale that into manufacturing. We have organizations like you'll hear today called Catapult. They're bringing in quite a number of startup companies in to the area that are looking at software, technology, manufacturing. That now brings a basis to leverage all the other things that we're talking about to the next dimension for the area, partnering with local companies, both in our region and outside our region, to create technology solutions. All told, you know, when you look at what we have in front of us, it's really up to all of us in this room to decide what direction this goes. And I think it's that decision and that continued collaboration that will make the difference in terms of where and how this community, this region, either prospers in the future, stays the same, or declines. And that's the leadership component that you all have demonstrated over many years that will either help us advance, like I said, stay the same or go backwards. But that's a choice, right? We need to all understand that now. This is a choice that we'll make because we do have the fundamental building blocks now in place to really change the trajectory in any direction we want it to go. When you look at housing as an example, it's in crisis everywhere. In Canada, if we can solve that by working together, the faster we solve that, the better lead we have on all these other aspects, because we'll be able to attract the types of people, the younger folks, the folks that are immigrating, like myself. I'm an immigrant. I'm a recent Canadian citizen of about a year, right? Maybe 2 now? A year? Thanks. So thank you. We can attract people into the area. And I think, getting some solutions put on the table in advance, easier said than done, but sometimes hard things have to be done, right? And my dad used to always tell me, just because it's hard doesn't mean you have to do it, right? You still have to do it, even if it is hard. Also, sometimes our own government can work against us. Recently, at the federal level with the tax discussion, it was really great to hear Minister Freeland talk about energy tax incentives, clean energy tax incentives. And that was really bolstering, because for the first time ever, they put nuclear in there. So they talked about small modular reactors, but also wind and solar. But what they left out was that our supply chain here in Canada actually makes can-do reactors. So it doesn't advantage our supply chain. When you look at it, 7 out of 10 wind turbines come from China. Just about all the solar panels come from China, so we'll be subsidizing Chinese manufacturing. And then when you look at SMRs, we will have a portion of that supply chain, but right now that's spread pretty much globally. But when you look at the CANDU reactor, that's made here. Like I said, 90% of the money we spend stays in Ontario, about 95 to 98% in Canada. So there's a petition starting by our supply chain here in Canada to say, hey, we want to be on a level playing field with these foreign manufacturers. Please put us in this same tax incentive as other clean energy technologies and give us the same opportunity. So if the petition's open till January 17th, there's about 8,000 signatures on it. If you haven't signed it, please sign it. And if you can, pass it around. We need to make that statement. What we don't want to run into is what was done in the United States, where renewables were incentivized, and eventually they started closing. They closed the best running nuclear plant in North America, if not the world, because it couldn't compete with the US taxpayer, right? So they closed it. But now 2 years later, with the Inflation Reduction Act, they finally realized they made that big mistake. And now they're making sure those existing plants that in native technology stays functional. Let's not make that same mistake and relive that. So I ask for your support in this regard. Anyway, I'll close up with a few things. One, I'm very proud to be a member of our communities here. I think it's just fantastic. When you look at all that we've done since 2016 to where we are today, we've put ourselves in a really good position to have a great sustainable future. An agricultural base, a tourism base, an energy base. What's next? Medical isotopes, advanced manufacturing. We start to create an economy that can be resilient to the disruptions in the world that Brock talked about. Why? So they don't necessarily impact us all. We may be down in an area, but up in another area. And that's the necessity of having a multi-dimensional or diversified economy. As we work together, we need businesses, we need developers, we need builders, we need municipalities, we need policy to stay in alignment. And it's going to take all of us working to keep that in alignment and advancing. And we're going to have to help each other, right? It can't be one area pitted against another. We have to help each other if we're all going to have a better well-being in the area. And then collectively, we we've termed the clean energy frontier, but it can be so much more. But it's a foundation of agriculture, tourism, clean energy now that we can build upon. So with that, I'll close up my discussion and take any questions that you might have.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Mike. My name is Mark from Westinghouse, newly relocated to Fort Elgin. Happy to see you here. My question, you just started talking about it actually, with respect to the Inflation Reduction Act, what do you think the implications will be for the Canadian nuclear industry? What do you think the implications will be for Bruce Power and the community? And how do you think our provincial and federal government should respond?
So Mark asked, with respect to the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., what will the implications be to our community, to our industry, and then what should provincial governments and federal governments do to help? So I think a couple-fold. I think from the clean energy front, it's going to provide opportunities abound for technology providers, technology suppliers. Clearly, with the amount of money that's being invested in the United States now in this space, it's unprecedented. It's tens of billions of dollars that are getting poured into clean energy. Well, twofold from that. It should enable our manufacturing base to participate in that. But what we have to watch not to avoid is a brain drain to the south. So I think, including our supply chain base in the Canadian tax and clean energy tax incentives helps stem that tide. And at the same time, then, it helps us to continue to evolve and advance and develop here in Canada in unison with what the U.S. is doing. That Pathways to Decarbonization report for Ontario says we need 88,000 new megawatts. That's 8 companies the size of Bruce Power. With the right incentives in place, we can start to build alongside the U.S. and then share those synergies across borders. And I think it really does provide an opportunity and a threat at the same time. So I think we need to see continued stable policy out of the province around energy, around clean energy. We need to see the municipal governments enabling clean energy. Like, you have to site permit, you have to be able to build clean energy foundations in an area. Like that takes some willpower to do sometimes. And then having said that, right, it's the right incentives from the federal level to make sure that we're on a level playing field. The last thing we want is a disadvantage for our manufacturing and really shipping Canadian taxpayer money to China. We don't want, as a Canadian citizen now, I don't want that, right? I want my money to stay here at home, right? I don't want it to go overseas. And it really ties into much of the discussion that Brock had about onshoring, reshoring, friendshoring, right? And how does that stimulate economic growth? So, great question. Well, hearing none, I thank you very much for listening, and I hope it was worth your time. Thank you.